Should you buy yourself a new microscope, or is it better to buy a used microscope if the cost is approximately the same? Hi, hello and welcome, Microbehunter here. And this podcast episode is for those newbie hobby microscopists who think about picking up microscopy as a hobby and who now consider buying a microscope, but don't really know what's the better deal. And is it better now to buy a used microscope, maybe a used quality microscope, or is it better to buy maybe for approximately the same price a completely new one, which basically might not be as well known of a brand? Okay, so this is kind of the question here, and I'm going to give you the answer right away. I know I might be simplifying a little bit, but let me explain later. My recommendation is you can buy yourself a used microscope, but then make sure that it's basically that you take 2 points into consideration. Number one, you have to be sure that it comes from a person who actually knows something about microscopes, and that this person can actually almost give you a guarantee that it works well. That is criteria number one. So maybe if you buy it from a microscope dealer, for example, or retailer, and if this retailer is selling used microscopes, then you can be quite sure that this is going to be fine, because this retailer is going to have serviced the microscope and it'll work fine. And the second point is my advice is buy it only if it is actually also a brand name microscope. So this means probably one of the big four brands, a quality microscope: Olympus, Nikon, Zeiss, or Leica, for example. These are the big four companies. And if you buy a used microscope from these companies, and if you have basically a retailer behind the whole thing to make sure that the quality is sufficiently good and that everything works, then you're pretty much on the safe side. Okay. Otherwise, I would probably recommend that you buy yourself a new microscope, maybe of a less known brand, because then you still have a warranty. And if there is a problem with the microscope, which is not likely to be the case because microscopes are not that complex really, but if there's a problem, then you can always get it returned within the warranty period. So this is basically my short answer to it, and I would like to elaborate a little bit. And I know that not everyone might agree with me, and a lot depends also on the individual requirements, of course. But generally, let me explain now. First of all, it is like this, that when you look at many of the forums, microscopy forums, where people ask, is this a good type of microscope? Should I buy it? And if it's I would say, not a very brand microscope, but it's a relatively low-cost microscope, then many of the people are going to respond in the forum, don't buy that. It's much better if you buy yourself a Zeiss Standard. That's the name of the microscope, a Zeiss Standard from the 80s or so, and make sure that you, for that same money, you can get a much better microscope. Right, that is often a response that you hear. Get yourself a used good quality microscope, and for the same money you get a much more value. Okay, I get the point. I get the point, but I do not always fully agree. I'm not saying that I always disagree, but I'm also saying I'm not always fully agreeing either. I'm somewhere stuck in the middle, I have to admit. The idea is the following: those brand name microscopes that have been around for a very long time. There is a large selection of, of spare parts available secondhand. So those companies, they have been manufacturing microscopes for many, many years, for research, for medicine, for education, and so on. And there is, for some of these brands, there is an incredibly large, second-hand market available. And as a matter of fact, it's so large that some people are actually completely assembling their own microscope only from parts that they buy together, right? And because the microscope is a modular design, and those brand microscopes were designed in such a way that they have highly interchangeable parts, because for every different type of research you could basically adapt the microscope to your needs, right? So there was a basic, the body was kind of a basic standard, and then you could attach whatever you wanted to this body, and you could basically modify the microscope in any way that you wanted to serve your specific needs. That's of course pretty nice and cool. And for this reason, if there's a problem with one of the parts, all you do is you go into eBay and you buy yourself a replacement part. So theoretically, what you can do is you can build yourself together a quality brand name microscope using spare parts or replacement parts. And this works particularly well with the brand name microscopes, like a Zeiss, for example. The Zeiss standard microscope is a very well known one and not manufactured anymore, but it has been manufactured in such large quantities. I've got some English problems today. In such large quantities that there is basically still plenty of spare parts available. So that is basically that one advantage, so to say. Having said that, it's probably not going to be cheap either. Okay, but that is from this viewpoint, from a flexibility viewpoint. Buying yourself a used microscope can be indeed an advantage, and also because you gain a lot of experience in the whole process. However, for people who don't know much about microscopes, and if you buy yourself a microscope from somewhere, sometimes you don't know, is the microscope now equipped with the parts that I specifically need or want? It's like this, that some of these microscopes have a research background and are equipped with highly specialized and expensive, specifically expensive optics, and optics maybe that a regular general purpose amateur user does not need. Okay, and these individual things can really drive up the price extremely quickly, even though it's a second-hand microscope, because the value is still there. And however, it might not be the best bargain for an amateur who wants to start off. Okay, and so for those people who basically want to start off microscopy and do not want to spend too much time thinking or worrying about whether the microscope is suitable for their needs, because often they don't even know what they want. I mean, they just want to start microscopy as a hobby. They have no specific needs really, other than that they want to look at nature and do general purpose natural exploration. So it's actually easier if they just buy themselves a new microscope, a relatively low cost microscope, maybe not one that has a very high resale value. Okay, maybe not, but that's also not necessary, because even then you're still going, if you take care of the microscope, you're still going to have it for a long time. So for around 200 euros, 250, 300 euros, or approximately dollar is now more or less the same, you can get yourself already a pretty good microscope. And I'm not talking about toy microscopes now. I'm actually talking about really good entry-level educational microscopes with which you can actually see the same things as the high-end microscopes, because often people are kind of worried. It's kind of cheap, it's only 200 euros. Can I actually see cells and so on? Yeah, of course. Yeah, that is not the point really. Of course you can. What those microscopes are lacking is often a certain degree of modularity. So basically that you're able to exchange parts, or that you can equip the microscope with specific filters maybe that are not available, because these filters are reserved maybe for other more high-end modular microscopes and so on. So, but generally, as it comes out of the box, you can get yourself already a very good microscope. And my advice generally is for people who start off with microscopy, maybe go the easy way. Okay, go online, find yourself a microscope retailer, and get yourself not the cheapest one maybe, but a decent entry-level educational microscope, and you'll be fine. And if you are basically interested in keeping up with the hobby also for the future, then my advice is then you can always buy yourself a second, third, or fourth microscope. I mean, I've got 5 right now, for example, right? So that is a little bit the thing. Okay, now I'm going to tell you my personal story with microscopes, because my 2 main compound microscopes that I have are the first one I bought new, and the second one I got used. It's one from the 1980s, as a matter of fact. It's a Olympus CHA microscope, for those of you who are interested. And when I got this microscope, it's been in educational use for about over 30 years. Really, it's that reliable. Really, that's what you call quality. Over 30 years, it's been in educational use, but after 30 years, the gears and the focus knobs and also all these things, the mechanics, started to become difficult to turn, because it had to be cleaned. The microscope has to be cleaned every couple of years, because the lubrication oil starts to become hard, and I could not turn the knobs anymore. Okay, so that's a normal thing that happens, especially after 30 years, right? So what I did is the following: call up the Olympus service company, and what they did is they I made an appointment with them, handed them over the microscope, and I had to pay 200 euros to get the microscope cleaned. Right, it's 200 euros. That's the price of a new microscope. So I actually wanted to pay 200 euros simply to get the microscope cleaned. That's not so cheap, but I have now a microscope that is like new. Okay. Now, why did I do that? Why did I not simply go out and buy myself a new microscope? And the reason is because in this case, there are a few additional filters and a few additional accessories that I really wanted to have, which were available for this used microscope. So in this particular case, it was a phase contrast. Okay. So I got out to eBay. I went to searched eBay. And I found a phase contrast filters and objectives, and I simply attached them. Okay, original Olympus phase contrast objectives and a condenser, phase contrast condenser, and that's basically was only possible because the company Olympus in the 1980s produced such a large amount of these microscopes that the number of accessories is still sufficiently large. I wouldn't say it's very large now, but sufficiently large. And if I had bought myself a low-cost 200 euro entry-level microscope, of course, then I would have had another microscope, but I would not have had phase contrast. So ultimately what ended up is the following. I ended up paying around simply for upgrading the microscope and for getting it cleaned. I paid around 500 euros, which is already the cost of a very good new microscope. But for my case, this was simply necessary because it had certain accessories that I simply wanted to have. I can now do different microscopy techniques that would have not otherwise been possible. So you see that actually in my case, buying myself a used microscope and parts for a used microscope actually made much more sense. Okay, because I actually knew what I wanted and I was sufficiently experienced that I can actually upgrade the microscope myself and all these things. I would not have been sufficiently experienced to actually clean the microscope myself because this actually required completely taking it apart. And I talked later on to the service guy and he said he was working several hours on this because and you need special tools and you need to know it. And it's for me that was simply too important to simply try it out myself, right? So this is the reason why I actually outsourced this, so to say, to a service company. Okay, so I just wanted to show you with this discussion a little bit is that it depends a little bit what your previous experiences are, what your expectations are, and all these things. But at the same time, I also want to say is also in your interests. I mean, if you want to if you're simply interested in I don't know, upgrading microscopes, and if this is kind of the way that you view the hobby, then please, by all means, go and buy yourself used microscopes. Maybe you can also get them repaired, or you repair them yourself if this is the way that you want to interpret the hobby. It's very rewarding, honestly. But if you say, okay, I just want to have, as a beginner, simple, quick, uncomplicated nature observations, then get yourself, by all means, a new microscope. Even if maybe the overall resale value after a couple of years is not that high. Microscopes, if taken care of, don't break so easily. And this means that for many, many years, you're still going to have a very good usable microscope. Okay, so it's not really lost money in that sense. And later on, if you're interested, you can always then buy yourself a second microscope, new or used, doesn't matter. It's then up to you entirely, or you make one yourself even. Yeah. So basically, this is simply a few thoughts on used versus new microscope, and I've to admit, if you read the forums a little bit, the debate can become a little bit emotional sometimes, and it can get semi-religious even. There are some folks who really say everything's got to be used because that's the only way that you can get high quality for a reasonably low price. And with high quality, they mean actually full metal microscopes, which have been made in the 80s or 90s or so, and which basically have, which are from a very well-known brand. That's basically one way of defining quality. Other people define quality differently. I would say, probably it doesn't matter so much as long as you enjoy the hobby. That's what I say right now. I think these are my closing words. I wish you all the best. Happy microbe hunting as always. And bye-bye, and see you next time.